"Mom, why are you wearing that uniform?" "Brandon, please, not here, not like this. I sent enough money for you to retire twice over. Where did it all go? There are things you don't know about your uncle, about all of us. I should have come home for your 65th. I should have come home for every birthday." Brandon Whitfield came home rich, jet-lagged, and carrying a small velvet box that held the diamond earrings his mother had once admired in a magazine 15 years ago. He had remembered. He had ordered them from a jeweler in Dubai 4 months in advance. He had imagined her opening them on the morning of her 70th birthday in the quiet kitchen of the riverfront condo he had bought her, the one with the wide windows and the soft light she always said reminded her of her own mother's house in the country. He had imagined a lot of things. None of them included the moment he was about to have at a Bojangles drive-thru off Interstate 26, just outside Columbia, South Carolina. Welcome to today's story. If you enjoy emotional family dramas, second chances, and twists you don't see coming, take a second to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And before we begin, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. 6 hours earlier, Brandon had stepped off a connecting flight from Atlanta and felt the Carolina humidity hit him like a wet wool coat. After 10 years in Abu Dhabi, he had almost forgotten what summer smelled like in the American South. Pine sap, hot asphalt, the faint, sweet rot of magnolia blossoms past their prime. He stood on the curb at Columbia Metropolitan for a long minute just breathing it in. He was 38 now. A petroleum engineer with a corner office, a 6-figure salary that had grown into a 7-figure one somewhere around year 4, and a quiet, careful confidence that had taken every one of those 10 years to build. He had not told his mother he was coming. He had not told Donald, his uncle, either. He wanted to walk through her door with the velvet box in his pocket and watch her face change. That was the plan. The plan had felt foolproof in his apartment overlooking the Persian Gulf. It felt slightly less foolproof now that he was standing on hot pavement with a rental car key in his hand and a hunger he could not quite name behind his ribs. Brandon's relationship with Donald had been built on phone calls. For 10 years, his mother's younger brother had been the bridge between Abu Dhabi and Carolina. Donald handled the paperwork, the bills, the property tax. The doctor visits Carol was too proud to mention. Brandon wired the money. Donald confirmed it landed. Carol, when Brandon spoke to her, always said the same thing in that soft, careful voice of hers. "I'm fine, baby. Don't you worry about me over there. You just do your work and come home when you can." And Brandon had believed her. Because Donald told him she was comfortable. Because the photos Donald sent at Christmas showed her in a clean kitchen with a poinsettia on the counter. Because believing made the distance easier to carry. Because every man who leaves home eventually learns to swallow guilt with a chaser of wire transfer confirmations. He picked up the rental car, a midsize sedan that smelled like artificial pine. The GPS pulled up the address of the condo, 72 minutes to Charleston. He set the cruise control and let his mind wander. Carol Whitfield, 70 years old on Saturday, the woman who had raised him alone after his father left when he was 9. The woman who had worked the front desk at a county clinic for 31 years so he could go to Clemson without a single loan. The woman who had cried quietly in the airport 10 years ago when he told her the Abu Dhabi posting was a 2-year contract that everyone knew might become longer. He had promised her 2 years. He had stayed 10. The guilt sat low in his stomach where it always lived, and he reached for the radio to drown it out. That was when he noticed the Bojangles sign rising above the tree line at exit 119, and his stomach reminded him he had not eaten since Frankfurt. Brandon pulled off the interstate and into the parking lot of a Bojangles that looked exactly like every other Bojangles he remembered from his childhood. Yellow trim, red roof, the smell of fried chicken and biscuits hanging in the heat like a memory you could chew. He thought about going inside, then thought better of it. The line at the drive-thru was 3 cars deep, but he was wearing dress slacks and a button-down that had seen 16 hours of travel, and the idea of sitting down at a booth under fluorescent lights felt like more than he could handle. He pulled into the drive-thru lane. The car ahead of him crept forward. He drummed his fingers on the steering wheel and watched a moth flutter against the menu board. He didn't notice the voice at first. The speaker was tinny and old, and the words came through with that particular drive-through crackle that turned every order into a guessing game. But the rhythm of it caught him. The slight lilt at the end of the sentence. The way the word welcome curled up just a little, like a hand reaching out. He frowned. The car ahead pulled forward to the window and the speaker repeated itself, clearer this time. Welcome to Bojangles. What can I get started for you, sweetheart? Brandon's hand went still on the wheel. He stared at the speaker. He told himself he was imagining things. He had been awake for almost 20 hours. The brain did strange things in airports and on highways. Voices became other voices. Memory bled into the present. He shook his head and inched the car forward. Then the speaker spoke again to the car behind him since he had forgotten to respond. Sir, you ready to order whenever you are. Take your time. It was her. He knew it the way a man knows his own name. He knew it the way a son knows the voice that read him to sleep for the first 9 years of his life. He knew it the way you know a song you have not heard in a decade the second the first note plays. His hands began to shake. He pressed them flat against the wheel and forced himself to breathe. There had to be an explanation. There were thousands of women in South Carolina who sounded like his mother. The woman in the speaker could be a stranger with the same regional accent, the same age, the same gentle way of calling people sweetheart. He told himself this in a rapid, desperate loop as he pulled forward to the order box. When he opened his mouth, his voice came out thin and uneven. Could I get a number 2, please, with sweet tea? There was a small pause on the other end. Then the voice came back, lighter than before, almost laughing. Of course you can, baby. Pull on around to the window. Brandon could not move. The car behind him honked, gentle at first, then less gentle. He pulled forward slowly, around the curve of the building, past the dumpster and the trim row of pansies someone had planted near the back door. The window came into view. A small sliding glass square framed by faded yellow paint. Behind it, a woman in a black visor and a Bojangles polo was counting bills into a register. Her hair was shorter than he remembered. Mostly silver now, where it had been mostly brown the last time he had seen it. She was thinner. Her shoulders sat a little lower inside the polo, but it was her. It was unmistakably her. Carol Whitfield, his mother, working a drive-through window on a Wednesday afternoon 10 miles from a condo he had been paying for since 2019. She slid the window open without looking up. That'll be 8:43, hun. She extended her hand for the card. Brandon could not speak. He stared at her and she stared at the card reader, and for what felt like a very long time, nothing happened. Then she looked up. The look on her face moved through 3 distinct stages in less than 2 seconds. First, the polite, professional smile of a woman who has greeted 10,000 customers. Then, a flicker of recognition, like a light coming on behind frosted glass. Then finally, the slow, devastating collapse of every defense she had spent 10 years building around the truth. Brandon. Her voice was barely a whisper. Oh, Brandon, what are you doing here? Behind him, another car honked. Neither of them heard it. For a long, suspended moment, Carol Whitfield and her son stared at each other through a sliding glass window with a sticker on it that said, "Please have payment ready." The car behind Brandon honked again, longer this time, and somewhere inside the restaurant a timer started beeping. Carol blinked and seemed to remember where she was. She reached up with a trembling hand and pressed a button on her headset, then leaned out the window just enough to be heard. "Carla, honey, I need to step away for 10 minutes. Can you cover the window?" There was a muffled voice in response. Carol nodded once and slid the window shut without taking Brandon's card. She came out the side door a moment later, still in her visor and polo, holding a small black apron she had untied as she walked. Brandon had pulled the rental car into a parking space near the dumpster. He got out as she came around the corner of the building. They met in the strip of shade beside the grease bin. Neither of them moved to hug the other. There was too much standing between them, 10 years of phone calls that had not been quite true, and now this. Carol stopped about 3 feet away and folded the apron in her hands the way she used to fold dish towels when she was nervous. Brandon noticed her sneakers. They were the cheap kind with the rubber peeling at the toe. He noticed her hands. The skin on the backs of them was thinner than it should have been, with bruises that looked like they came from grocery bags and door frames and the small accidents of a body that worked too hard. Mom. His voice cracked on the word. What is this? Carol looked down at her shoes. I didn't want you to find out like this. Find out what? She did not answer. Brandon felt something hot rising in his chest and he forced it back down. He had been an engineer for 15 years. He had learned to ask the next question instead of the loudest one. He took a slow breath. How long have you been working here? Carol's eyes filled, but she did not let the tears fall. 2 years, baby. About 2 years. 2 years. The number landed in him like a stone dropped into a deep well. He had wired her brother $140,000 in the last 2 years alone. He had paid the property tax on a condo she was supposed to be sitting in right now, drinking coffee and watching the boats on the Cooper River. He had wired extra at Christmas because Donald said the heat pump needed replacing. He had wired extra in March because Donald said the roof had a soft spot. He had wired extra in June because Donald said Carol wanted to see a specialist about her knee. Carol's knee. He looked down at her cheap sneakers and felt something in his chest start to fold in on itself. The condo. He could barely get the word out. Mom, are you living in the condo? Carol shook her head, slow and small. Her lips were pressed together so tight they were almost white. Where are you living? I have a room. She said it quickly, like she wanted to get it out before he could interrupt. It's a nice room. A lady I used to work with at the clinic, she rents out her upstairs. It's clean, it's safe. She has a porch. Brandon closed his eyes. Mom, don't, she said. Please don't. Not here, not in this parking lot. He opened his eyes. She was looking at him now, really looking, and behind the apology in her face he saw something else. Something steady. Something that had been waiting a long time to be seen. He had been bracing himself for a woman who had been deceived, a woman who had been robbed and was too ashamed to admit it. But that was not what he was looking at. The woman in front of him was not surprised by any of this. She was tired, yes. She was sorry, yes. But she was not shocked. She had known. Whatever had happened to the money, whatever Donald had done, his mother had known about it. And for some reason he could not yet name, she had let it happen. Mom, he said very quietly. What did you do? Carol Whitfield closed her eyes for a long moment, and when she opened them again, she looked older than she had 2 minutes ago. Not in her face exactly, but in her shoulders. The way they settled, finally, as though she had been holding them up against a wind that had just stopped blowing. She glanced over her shoulder at the back door of the Bojingles, then at the dumpster, then at her son. A car pulled into the drive-thru behind the building. The speaker crackled. Someone laughed inside the kitchen. The world kept moving. Not here, Brandon, I'm asking you, not here. Brandon swallowed the dozen questions stacked in his throat. He nodded once. Okay, where? There's a park about a half-mile up the road, Maple Grove. I take my break there sometimes. I can be there in 15 minutes. I have to finish my shift. I can't leave Carla holding the window during the lunch rush. Mom, he almost laughed. It was not a happy sound. You're going to finish your shift. Carol's chin lifted a quarter inch. It was the same gesture he had seen 1,000 times across kitchen tables and report cards and parent-teacher conferences. Yes, Brandon, I'm going to finish my shift. I made a commitment to these people and they have been good to me. I'll be at the park at 2:30. There's a bench under the big oak by the playground. You'll see it. He wanted to argue. He wanted to put her in the rental car and drive her somewhere with air conditioning and a comfortable chair. He wanted to call the regional manager and have her fired by sundown so she would never have to put that visor on again. But he looked at her face, and he saw the same stubbornness that had gotten her through 31 years at the clinic and through 9 years of single motherhood and through a husband walking out the door without a forwarding address. And he understood that arguing with her in this parking lot would only cost him something he could not afford to lose. So he nodded. 2:30. The bench by the oak. She reached out then, just briefly, and laid her hand on his forearm. Her hand was warm and dry and small. I'm sorry, baby. I'm so sorry you had to see me like this. Then she turned and walked back toward the side door of the Bojingles, retying her apron as she went. Brandon stood in the parking lot for a long time after she disappeared inside. He could feel the sun on the back of his neck. He could smell the grease from the exhaust fan overhead. He could hear, faintly, the sound of his mother's voice through the drive-thru speaker, greeting the next customer with the same warmth she had once used to greet him when he came home from school. He walked slowly back to the rental car and got in and sat with his hands on the wheel for what felt like a very long time. Then he reached for his phone. He pulled up Donald's contact. The photo was a few years old, his uncle grinning in a fishing hat on a dock somewhere, holding up a small bass. Brandon stared at the photo. He thought about the calls, the Christmas updates, the careful, cheerful voice on the other end of the line saying everything was fine. Your mama's just fine. She's playing bridge on Thursdays now. She's got a little garden going on the balcony. Brandon's thumb hovered over the call button. He did not press it. Not yet. There were things he needed to know first. Things he needed to see with his own eyes before he gave Donald a single warning. And a man who had been an engineer for 15 years knew the value of gathering data before you confronted a system that had been quietly failing for years. He started the car. He had 2 hours until he was supposed to meet his mother at a park bench in a town he had not lived in for a decade. He pulled out of the Bojangles parking lot and turned the GPS toward the address on Daniel Island. The condo, the one with the wide windows and the soft light, the one he had been paying for since 2019. He needed to see it. He needed to know who, if anyone, was living in his mother's home. The drive to Daniel Island took 40 minutes. Brandon barely noticed the scenery. The condo complex sat on a quiet curve of the Wando River, surrounded by crepe myrtles in full pink bloom. Brandon remembered the day he had signed the paperwork from a coffee shop in Abu Dhabi, scrolling through photos on his laptop, while the call to prayer drifted in from the street outside. 3 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, a south-facing balcony with a view of the water. He had paid cash. $412,000 wired directly from his savings to the closing attorney's escrow account. Donald had handled the keys, the move-in, the furniture from a catalog Carol had picked out over the phone. Donald had sent photos of the finished living room, a blue couch, a glass coffee table, a framed print of a heron Carol had admired at a craft fair. Brandon parked in a visitor space and sat in the car for a moment. Then he got out and walked up the path to the front door of Unit 4B. He had a key on his keyring, an extra Donald had mailed him 5 years ago in case he ever came home unexpectedly. He had never used it. He pulled it out now and looked at it. Then he knocked instead. He did not know why. Some instinct told him to knock. A woman opened the door. She was in her late 30s, blonde, holding a toddler on her hip. Behind her, Brandon could see a hallway with toys scattered across the floor and a stroller folded against the wall. The woman looked at him with the polite, slightly guarded expression of a stranger answering a stranger's knock. "Can I help you?" Brandon's mouth went dry. He glanced at the unit number on the door to make sure he had the right one. He did. "I'm sorry," he said. "I think I have the wrong unit. Does Carol Whitfield live here?" The woman frowned. "No, there's no Carol here. We've been renting this place for almost 3 years. The owner is a man, Don Whitfield. He's our landlord." Brandon felt the ground shift very slightly under his feet. He kept his face calm. He had learned in 15 years of conference rooms with men who lied about reservoir estimates how to keep his face calm. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said. "I must have an old address." "Thank you." She nodded, already closing the door, the toddler reaching for the door handle with a chubby hand. The door clicked shut. Brandon stood on the welcome mat for a moment longer, then turned and walked back to the car. He sat down in the driver's seat and stared straight ahead through the windshield at a row of perfectly maintained shrubs. His Uncle Donald, the man who had told him for 3 years that his mother was enjoying the view of the river, was renting out the unit Brandon had bought for her. Renting it out, presumably, and pocketing the income on top of the wire transfers. Brandon did the math without meaning to. 3 years, probably $2,000 a month conservatively for a unit like this in this neighborhood, $72,000 in rent on top of everything else. He realized his hands were shaking again, not from shock this time, from something colder. He took out his phone and opened his banking app and pulled up the transfer history. He scrolled. Every month for 10 years, a transfer to Donald's account. Sometimes one transfer. Sometimes, too, property tax, repairs, medical, birthday, Christmas, knee specialist, roof, heat pump. He scrolled and watched a decade of his working life roll past in 5-digit increments. He did not call Donald, not yet. He set the phone face down on the passenger seat and started the car. He had 40 minutes until 2:30. He drove slowly back across the bridge toward Mount Pleasant, taking the long way, giving himself time to think. He passed a billboard for a personal injury attorney. He passed a strip mall with a nail salon and a payday lender side by side. He passed a church with a sign out front that said, "Love your neighbor even when it's hard." He almost laughed at that one. Maple Grove Park was a small green square wedged between a Baptist church and a daycare center. Brandon parked at the curb and saw the oak immediately. It was enormous, the kind of tree that had probably been standing there since before the church was built, with branches that reached almost all the way to the ground. Under it, on a green bench, sat his mother. She had taken off her visor. Her hair was matted where the band had pressed against it. She was looking across the playground at the daycare next door, and there was something in her face Brandon did not yet understand. Brandon crossed the grass slowly. Carol heard his footsteps and turned, and for the first time since the drive-through window she smiled. It was a small, tired smile, but it was real. She patted the bench beside her. He sat down. The wood was warm from the sun. From this angle he could see what she had been looking at. The daycare next door had a fenced playground with a small plastic slide and a sandbox. Maybe a dozen children were out for the afternoon. A teacher in a blue shirt was helping a little girl with pigtails climb the steps to the slide. The little girl was maybe 3 years old with dark curls and a determined frown on her face. "That's Maya," Carol said quietly. "She's 3.5. She comes out at 2:15 every day. They go back in at 3. Brandon looked at his mother. "Maya." Carol nodded. She did not take her eyes off the little girl. "She's Donald's granddaughter." Brandon waited. He could feel the story coming now, could feel it gathering itself the way weather gathers before a summer storm. He did not push. He had learned that much, at least in the last few hours. He let her find her own way to it. "Donald has a daughter you never knew about," Carol said. "Her name is Lindsay. She's 26. He had her with a woman down in Beaufort back in the 90s before he married Aunt Patricia. Patricia never knew. Nobody knew. Donald kept her a secret his whole life. He sent the mother money on the side, the way some men do. He went down to see Lindsay twice a year, told everyone he was going fishing." Brandon felt his eyebrows pull together. Donald had a second family, not back then, just a daughter he visited. Patricia and Donald never had children of their own, you remember that. Carol's voice was steady now, the way it got when she was telling him something difficult. "Patricia passed in 2017. You remember, you sent flowers." Brandon remembered. He had been in Abu Dhabi. He had not been able to fly home for the funeral. After Patricia died, Carol said, Donald started spending more time down in Beaufort. Lindsay was grown by then. She had a little boy already, and then in 2021 she had Maya. And Maya was born sick. Carol's voice did not break, but something in it bent. Brandon watched her hands fold and unfold the visor in her lap. "Maya has a kidney condition, something congenital. She's been in and out of the children's hospital in Charleston since she was 4 months old. Lindsay works 2 jobs and her boyfriend works construction, and they have no insurance worth the name. The bills are something you would not believe, Brandon. I've seen the bills." Donald started covering them. At first it was just a few thousand here and there, but the surgeries kept coming. The specialists, the medications. "There's one of her medications that costs almost $9,000 a month, and the assistance program kept denying them." Brandon felt cold. He already knew where this was going. He let her get there. "About 2.5 years ago," Carol said, "I started noticing things. Donald was driving a new truck. He started talking about some investment he'd made, some crypto thing a man at his church had told him about. He said he was going to triple our money. He said by the end of the year he'd be able to pay back everything he'd borrowed." Borrowed. That was the word he used. She finally looked at Brandon. Her eyes were dry. They had done their crying a long time ago. "I went into my account at the credit union and I looked at the transfers. I saw what was coming in from you, and I saw what was going back out to Donald the same week. I saw the condo paperwork. I called the leasing office on Daniel Island and pretended to be interested in renting, and the girl on the phone told me Unit 4B had been occupied by a lovely young family for over a year. I knew, Brandon, I knew everything. She turned back toward the playground. The little girl with the dark curls had reached the top of the slide. She was sitting at the top now, hesitating, looking down at the teacher with the same determined frown. I should have called you, Carol said. I picked up the phone 100 times. I almost called you the night I found out, but I went down to Beaufort the next weekend. I told Donald I knew, and he took me to meet Maya. She was 8 months old. She was hooked up to a feeding tube. Lindsay was sleeping on a cot in the hospital room, and I looked at that baby, Brandon, and I knew I could not be the reason she lost her grandfather and her medicine in the same week. Brandon did not speak. He could not yet. He watched the little girl at the top of the slide finally make up her mind and push herself off, and the teacher caught her at the bottom, and Maya laughed, and the sound carried across the grass to the bench under the oak. Carol smiled at the sound the way a person smiles at a familiar piece of music. Then she went on. I made a decision, she said. I know it was the wrong decision. I want you to hear me say that. It was wrong of me to keep this from you. You worked too hard for that money. You sent it to me in good faith, and I let your uncle take it, and I cannot pretend that was right. But I want you to understand how I got there. I want you to understand what I was looking at. Brandon nodded. He still could not speak. I told Donald I would not turn him in, Carol said, but I told him the money was going to stop. I told him I was going to start putting myself in a position to give it back to you one day, every dollar of it if it took me the rest of my life. I told him he was going to pay me back too when the crypto thing finally worked, which of course it never did. He lost it all, Brandon, every penny. I knew he was going to lose it. I'm not stupid. But by then it was not really about the money anymore. It was about that baby. She looked at her hands. I went to the manager at the credit union and I asked him to set up a separate savings account that Donald had no access to. And then I went to find a job. I was 68 years old, Brandon. I had not worked since I retired from the clinic. I tried 3 places before Bojangles hired me. The manager there is a young man named Deshawn. He looked at my application and he looked at me and he said, Miss Carol, are you sure? And I said yes. And he gave me a job. Brandon found his voice. Mom, why didn't you just call me? I would have flown home. I would have paid Maya's bills directly. We could have handled this. Carol turned to look at him then fully, and there was something in her face that stopped him. It was not shame. It was not apology. It was the look of a woman who had thought through a hard problem and arrived at her answer the long way. Because you would have pressed charges, baby. Carol's voice was very gentle. I know you. You would have flown home on the next plane, and you would have called a lawyer, and you would have had your uncle arrested by Friday. And maybe he deserved it. Maybe he still does. But Lindsay would have lost the only person who was keeping her child alive. Maya's medicine would have stopped, and I could not be the woman who let that happen. Not to a baby. Not because of money. Brandon opened his mouth and closed it again. He thought of half a dozen arguments. Each one died before it reached his lips, because each one assumed that Brandon Whitfield, at 38, with a 7-figure salary and an apartment overlooking the Persian Gulf, would have been a person whose first phone call from his mother after 10 years away was to ask for help with a sick great-niece in Beaufort. He did not know if that was true. He hoped it was, but he was not sure. And his mother, who had known him longer than he had known himself, had not been sure either. She had not been willing to gamble a child's life on what kind of son he had become while she was not looking. The other thing, Carol said, and her voice softened further, was Maya herself. The daycare here, this one, it's the closest one to the children's hospital that takes kids with her kind of medical needs. Lindsay moved up to North Charleston a year ago so Maya could be closer to her specialists. And when I found out where Maya was going during the day, I asked Deshawn for a transfer to this particular Bojangles. It's not the one I started at. He moved me here in March. I take my breaks at 2:15 so I can watch her on the playground. She doesn't know who I am yet. Lindsay said maybe at her next birthday we'll start letting her call me Aunt Carol. She has so many doctors and so many strangers in her little life. They did not want to confuse her. Carol smiled at the playground. I have watched that baby learn to walk from this bench, Brandon. I have watched her learn to climb that slide. Some days that is the only thing that gets me through a 10-hour shift on swollen feet. Brandon put his face in his hands. For a long time, Brandon did not lift his head. He sat with his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands, and he let himself feel the full weight of the last 6 hours. The drive-thru, the condo door, the toddler on a stranger's hip, the bills his mother had carried in her purse, the little girl on the slide, the careful, patient calculus of a 68-year-old woman who had decided that her own dignity was worth less than a baby's medicine. He felt anger and grief and a kind of bewildered admiration he did not quite know how to hold. He felt underneath all of it a sharper, more honest pain. His mother had not trusted him to choose mercy over money, and the worst part was she might have been right. When he finally lifted his head, Carol was still watching the playground. Maya had moved to the sandbox. "Mom," Brandon said quietly, "I work for one of the largest energy companies in the world. We have a foundation. We fund pediatric medical care in 23 countries. I sit on the committee that approves the grants. Lindsay and Maya could have been on a treatment plan within 48 hours. Maya could have had a private pediatric nephrologist. Lindsay could have had housing assistance. None of this had to happen." "I know," Carol said. "I know that now. I did not know it then. I did not know what you could do, and I did not know what you would do, and I was scared, Brandon. I was so scared of being wrong, of trusting the wrong person again. I had already trusted Donald. I did not want to find out that I had to be afraid of trusting you too." The words hit him harder than anything Donald had done. He nodded slowly. "Fair enough," he said. "Okay, fair enough." They sat in silence for a while. The teacher in the blue shirt began rounding up the children. Maya stood up from the sandbox, dusted her hands on her dress, and walked obediently toward the door. Just before she went inside, she paused and looked toward the bench under the oak. She did not wave. She probably did not see them. But Carol lifted her hand anyway, just a small motion at the level of her knee, and held it there until the daycare door closed behind the last child. Brandon stood up. "Come on," he said. "Where?" Carol asked. "To get your things," he said. "From whatever room you're renting. You're staying with me at the hotel tonight. Tomorrow we're going to see a lawyer, and we're going to see Maya's doctors, and we're going to figure this out together. I'm not making any decisions about Donald yet. I want to hear from him first. I want to see Lindsay and Maya. I want to know everything before I do anything." Carol looked up at him for a long moment. Then she nodded once and put her visor back on and stood up. She moved more slowly than she should have at 70. Brandon offered his arm. She took it. That evening, in a suite at a hotel on the harbor, Brandon called Donald. He kept his voice very level. He said only that he was in town, that he had seen Carol, that they needed to talk, and that he wanted Donald to meet him at a particular conference room at a particular law office at 9 the next morning. He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse. Donald, on the other end of the line, was silent for a very long time. Then he said, in a small voice Brandon had never heard from him before, "All right, son. I'll be there." Brandon hung up and sat on the edge of the bed for a moment. Then he called his executive assistant in Abu Dhabi, who was already awake because it was the middle of the morning there. He told her he was extending his leave indefinitely. He told her to pull the Foundation's pediatric medical grant application, the one for U.S. cases, and to have it ready for him by morning. She did not ask questions. She had worked for him for 6 years. She knew the voice he used when something had broken. The next morning at 9, Brandon walked into the conference room of a law office on Broad Street with his mother on his arm. Donald was already there. He was a small, tired-looking man in a blue button-down that was a size too big for him. He had lost weight. His hands were folded on the table in front of him, and his eyes were red. He looked up when Carol and Brandon walked in, and the first thing he did was look at Carol, and the second thing he did was begin to cry. Quietly, without sound, the way a man cries who has been preparing to for a long time. The lawyer was a woman named Patris Holloway. She had been recommended to Brandon by a partner at the firm his company used in Charleston. She had 30 years of experience in family financial disputes, elder protection, and what she called the soft fraud that families do to each other when nobody wants to call the police. She was in her early 60s, gray-haired, with reading glasses on a beaded chain and a yellow legal pad already covered in notes. She had spoken to Brandon for an hour the night before. She knew most of the story before anyone sat down. She let Donald speak first. He did not ask for mercy. He did not try to explain the crypto investment, though Brandon could see the shape of that story sitting in his uncle's face, the embarrassment of a man who had been told he was getting in on the ground floor of something and had only later understood that he was the ground floor. Donald told them, in a halting, miserable voice, exactly how much he had taken and exactly where it had gone. Some of it to Maya's medical bills. He had the receipts. He produced them from a manila folder he had brought with him, organized by date, totaling just under $200,000 over 3 years. Some of it to Lindsay's rent and groceries. Some of it to the crypto venture, which he had lost almost entirely. A smaller portion, which he confessed to with the particular shame of a man confessing the least defensible part, had gone to his own truck, his own clothes, 2 trips to Las Vegas, and a brief, unsuccessful attempt to gamble his way out of the hole he had dug. The rent income from the condo had gone partly into Maya's medical fund and partly, Donald admitted, into his own checking account. When he finished, the room was quiet. Patris took off her glasses and looked at Brandon. Brandon looked at his mother. Carol's hands were folded in her lap. She did not look at her brother. She looked at the window. After a moment, Brandon spoke. "I want to be very clear about what is going to happen," he said. His voice was steady. He had spent half the night thinking about exactly how to say this. "First, Maya. By the end of this week, Lindsay and Maya are going to be enrolled in our foundation's pediatric care program. Maya will have a full medical team at MUSC, including the best pediatric nephrologist in the state. Her medications will be covered in full for as long as she needs them. Lindsay will have housing assistance, transportation support, and a case manager who will help her stop working 2 jobs. None of this is contingent on anything you do or say, Donald. Maya gets help because Maya is a child and she needs it. That is the end of that part." Donald put his face in his hands. "Second," Brandon said, "Donald, you are going to be charged. I have already spoken with Patris and with the district attorney's office. We are filing for elder financial exploitation and for the fraud related to the condo. You took money from my mother and you took money from me, and you did it under false pretenses for years. The fact that some of the money went to a good cause does not change the fact that you stole it. You did not ask. You did not tell. You made a series of decisions on behalf of people who would have made better decisions themselves, and a child suffered for longer than she needed to because you were too proud or too scared to come to me directly." Donald nodded into his hands. He did not argue. "Third," Brandon said, "restitution. Patris is going to draw up a structured plan. You will pay back what you can on a schedule we will agree on. You will not lose your house. You will not lose contact with Lindsay or Maya. Your sentence, if the DA agrees, will be structured to allow you to continue working and continue being a grandfather. I do not want Maya to grow up with a grandfather in prison. I do not want Lindsay to lose her father a second time, because in a way she already lost the one she thought she had. But there will be consequences, Donald. There have to be. Not because I want revenge. Because the only way any of us is ever going to trust each other again is if this is handled all the way through by people whose job it is to handle it on a piece of paper with everyone's name on it." Donald lifted his head. His eyes were wet. Carol was looking at him now. Brandon could not read her expression. After a moment, she reached across the table and laid her hand on top of her brother's hand. She did not squeeze. She just rested it there. Donald began to cry again, harder this time, and Carol let him. Patris took her glasses off and turned them in her hands. "That," she said quietly, "is one of the more sensible plans I have heard come out of a family meeting in this room in a long time." Brandon almost laughed. The following Monday, Carol Whitfield walked into the Bojangles off Interstate 26 and handed her visor to Deshawn, the young manager who had hired her at 68. She had brought him a card. Inside the card was a thank you note in her careful clinic handwriting and a check, made out to the Bojangles Employee Assistance Fund, in an amount that made Deshawn sit down very suddenly at his desk. He hugged her. He told her she was always welcome to come back for biscuits on the house. Carla cried in the back. The lunch crew gave her a small cake that said, "We will miss you, Miss Carol," in slightly crooked blue icing. Carol cried too. Then she untied her apron for the last time, folded it neatly on the counter, and walked out into the parking lot where Brandon was waiting in the rental car with the air conditioning running. The condo on Daniel Island was returned to her within 30 days. The young family who had been renting it from Donald were given 6 months and the security deposit for a comparable unit, and a moving allowance Brandon paid for out of his own account. Carol moved in on a Saturday in October. The view from the balcony was exactly as Brandon had imagined it. The wide windows, the soft light, the herons in the marsh grass at low tide. Carol stood on the balcony the first evening and cried again, but it was a different kind of crying. Brandon stood next to her and did not say anything. He had learned, finally, that there were times when a son's only job was to stand there. Maya started her new treatment plan within a week of the meeting in the conference room. The foundation moved fast. Within 2 months, her color was better. Within 4, she had gained almost 3 pounds. Lindsay quit one of her 2 jobs and started taking community college classes in the evenings. Brandon met her for the first time at the Children's Hospital in Charleston on a Tuesday afternoon. She was small and tired and suspicious of him, which he understood and did not hold against her. He brought her a coffee. He told her very plainly that he was sorry it had taken him this long to know she existed. She did not forgive him in that conversation. She did not need to. He did not need her to. He told her he was going to be around, and he was. Maya called him Uncle B by Christmas. The first time she did it, sitting on his knee at the dining room table in the Daniel Island condo, reaching for a roll, Brandon excused himself and went into the bathroom and sat on the edge of the tub and cried for 10 minutes. Then he washed his face and went back out and asked her to pass the gravy. Donald served 18 months of probation and 100 hours of community service at a senior center in North Charleston. He paid back what he could on the schedule Patris had drawn up. He did not miss a payment. He came to Sunday dinner at Carol's condo once a month, awkward and quiet at first, then gradually less so. Carol did not pretend that nothing had happened. She did not forgive him quickly, and she did not forgive him cheaply. But she let him sit at her table. She let him hold Maya. She let him be, slowly, the brother and grandfather he had spent 3 years failing to be while pretending to be both. It was not a clean ending. It was a real one. Brandon took a position with his company's domestic operations and moved back to Charleston in the spring. He bought a house on Sullivan's Island, 10 minutes from his mother. He kept the velvet box with the diamond earrings. He gave them to her on her 71st birthday instead, in the kitchen of the condo, with Maya on his lap pulling at the wrapping paper. Carol cried again. She seemed to do that more easily now, as if some valve she had kept screwed shut for a decade had finally been allowed to open. The drive-thru became a family joke. Whenever Brandon was running late for dinner, Carol would call him and say, in her best speaker box voice, "Welcome to Bojangles. What can I get started for you, sweetheart?" He would laugh every single time. So would Maya, who did not understand the joke but understood that it made her grandmother happy, which was enough reason to laugh. Sometimes, on long drives, Brandon would pass a Bojangles sign on the interstate and feel his throat tighten for no reason at all, and he would think about the woman in the visor counting bills into a register, and about all the things love asks of us that we never see coming. If this story moved you, take a second to like the video and subscribe for more. And if there is someone in your life you have been meaning to call, someone whose voice you have not heard in too long, do not wait for a birthday. Do not wait for a flight home. Pick up the phone tonight. Sometimes the people we love the most are the quietest about what they are carrying. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next story.